Hey guys, and welcome back to another video. A couple of weeks ago I've showed you this military laptop. Now today in this video we're going to be going more in depth into this laptop, and I mean that quite literally. So we're going to take it apart, see what's inside, and trust me, I realize that to the untrained eye this looks like a big mess, but believe me when I tell you that everything is under control. I'm pretty sure I still remember where everything needs to go. Hopefully we'll also be able to fix it, although I cannot promise you anything. Now, first thing we need to do is we need to create a cable for this laptop, because I had to return the original cable to the generous person who gave me this laptop, Mr. Han Wen. I hope I pronounced that correctly. So apparently this is a fairly common military grade connector, so I bought this off of Mouser, but in order to check the pinout of the connector I hooked up my multimeter. So we need to find out which pin corresponds to chassis ground, which is this one. So this was marked A, and then B and C are your AC currents. So I've taken the standard computer power cable, some heat shrink tubing for the individual wires, but also one for the entire cable assembly. So I'm just going to be tinning the ends here. Don't forget to add the heat shrink before I go ahead and solder everything. I have these little heat shrinks here also. And then it's just a matter of soldering the wires onto their respective connections here. And then we just add the heat shrink here. Here my daughter is helping me out with the continuity checks. Notice how the cable is disconnected and I'm not exposing AC current to my daughter. And next up we'll just heat up the heat shrink tubing. Now I don't have the correct cable housing for this, so I'm just going to be using some additional heat shrink around the outer edge of the cable here. So time to start the laptop and see what we have. And immediately you see that the screen is acting up a little bit. So while it's doing its memory count here, you can see this discoloration of the screen and its overall odd behavior. And it's not only on the LCD, but also when I hook up an external display or when I hook up my capturing device, I get the same screen distortion. Now, this only happens when the screen is actually changing. So here, while the screen is sitting idle, it's actually pretty fine. It's only when the screen changes that we see this kind of flickering and color distortion. So let's take a look at the capturing device. So as you can see, while it's doing its memory count, you see that the background is completely red, and during the memory count you also get these green horizontal lines. So this is already weird. Then it flashes green, and while it's sitting idle it's perfectly fine, but when it changes it kind of distorts. For example, here nothing happens on the screen and it seems to be fine. And the same thing happens when entering the BIOS. So when it's sitting idle nothing happens, but as soon as you change the menu you see the screen flashing. For example, here in this particular screen you see the time ticking away, and with every second you see the screen flashing. And the same thing happens when you change the menu, but while it's sitting idle it's perfectly fine. And it also does the same thing when booting into Windows. So here we have the Windows 98 splash startup screen, which is also distorted. And also when Windows is starting, you see the kind of distortion of the screen. So now that we know the problem, let's go ahead with the disassembly and see if we can find something. So I'll start with this keyboard here, which is detachable, but you cannot easily remove it because the cable is kind of bolted down to the chassis using a couple of screws. So that's a bit unfortunate. Luckily we can remove this top plate thing which holds the keyboard in place. So there are a couple of screws that we need to unscrew, and then the entire thing can come off. There is one pretty short cable that connects this keyboard cable onto the mainboard, so we're just going to be removing that one so that we can set this whole assembly aside for the moment. And here we get a first glimpse of the internals of the machine. So let's see what we have here. We have the disk drive, we have the drive bay area for the hard drive, we have a display, a fan, a speaker, and the power supply. We've got some ribbon cables here that go to various parts of the main board. I also have this compact flash to IDE adapter that I can use to load up software, which was also provided by the kind gentleman that donated the PC, so thank you very much. Here on the left we have a small PCB which appears to hold a Pcmcia card, which is used for the network. And it has two ribbon cables which kind of look like floppy drive cables, but they aren't floppy drive cables, that go to the main board. Here we have the disk drive, which is attached to the main board using this very small ribbon cable, not your standard floppy drive connector. And then here on the right we have some kind of display, we have a fan, we have the speaker, and we have some cables here that we will need to remove if we want to get this whole assembly out. Again, there are a couple of screws here at the front that we need to remove in order to get this assembly out, so let's go ahead and do that. And then with a little bit of wiggling, we should get this whole assembly out of the case. Of course, I ripped off the floppy drive cable. Luckily, nothing was broken, but there were still a couple of connectors here and there that were tied to this thing that needed to be removed. For example, there was this little cable here that goes into the motherboard, and we also had these two connectors going into the display. A lot of these connectors and cables seem to be glued into place, so I'm going to be removing that. And these cables seem to come from the power supply, so I need to look at what all these cables are doing and where they are coming from. So this Pcmcia card was also still connected, and then the whole assembly could be removed. And here we have it, so not that much to see. We have the Pcmcia card, the disk drive, an empty bay for the hard drive. So the battery is sitting beneath the hard drive, so this is a 24 volts, 3000 milliamp hour battery. Weighs quite a bit, and there you have it. So a lot of the cables in this laptop were glued into place, and there are two connectors here on the Pcmcia PCB which kind of resembles floppy drive connectors, but I don't think that they are, so they probably have some kind of custom pinout. And here we have the very slim 1.44 megabyte disk drive. And it doesn't use your standard floppy drive cable, but rather this flat flex cable here. Also on this assembly we have the LCD display. Now before we can access the motherboard, we need to remove this backplate here, so let's go ahead and do that. So let's take a peek inside here. So we have the external Scuzzy connector, which is using a fairly standard Scuzzy cable here. Basically all these connectors are just kind of extended through this back plane. So this is the parallel port. There is this Ethernet connector here, which is not connected, so we'll need to see where this one should go. And on the exterior, this is using this kind of round Ethernet standard, so it's not your standard RJ45. And the other cables you see here are for the external VGA connector and the two serial ports. And the final cable on this back plane here is the BAMS connector, which I cannot remove that easily, as the cable is also soldered onto the motherboard. So here we can see the motherboard, which is actually two compartments. So the top part is probably the video circuit and some other stuff. So here there are some cables coming from the LCD into this part of the PCB. So let's go ahead and remove those. Now to get this board off of the main board, we need to unscrew a couple of bolts here. Only to notice that you cannot get the damn thing out because this kind of power supply which sits on the right is kind of blocking this PCB somewhat, so I cannot pull it out. But then luckily I found that there was a way to slide out the motherboard, both compartments, out of the case using this kind of rail system where you can just push the motherboard to the back and then it should come out like so. So let's take a look at the motherboard here. There are actually three parts. We have the daughter board here, which sits on top of the main board. And then we have kind of an expansion card which slots into the motherboard. And that expansion card is kind of hooked up to this backplane here still with the BAMS cable from the radio. So I'm guessing that the culprit of our video issue is somewhere located here on this daughter board, because this board here also contains the video chip and the video memory. So we can pull it off the main board like so, and here we have it. So here we have the PCB, which contains the Scuzzy connector, the parallel port connector, and some interesting chips. It also contains this Ethernet connector. You might have noticed that there was an Ethernet cable coming off of the back of the PC, so that should plug in right here. And then we have these two kind of look like floppy drive cables, but they are used to hook up the Pcmcia daughter board. So let's look at the chips that we have here. So we have an Intel chip here, which is for the Ethernet card. We have an LSI chip for the Scuzzy. We have a parallel port connector. I'm not really seeing the chip that drives that. Perhaps that's on the main board itself. But here we have the VGA chip and the video memory. And we also have a Cirrus Logic chip, which is not a video chip, but is used to act as a PCMCIA controller. And then we have various connectors here that go to the LCD panel to drive the video signal to the LCD. And on the back you can see the two connectors which are being used to hook up this daughter board up to the main board. And speaking of the main board, here we have it. So let's first take a look at the external connectors that we have here. So we have two serial ports and we have a VGA connector. Now notice that the actual VGA chip or video chip is not included here, but is included on this daughter board here, which is this chip that you see here with the video memory. And on the back of the motherboard, we have the CPU with the CPU cooler. So this is an Intel Pentium 200 MMX CPU. Here you can see the back of the CPU. So it's soldered onto the motherboard, so there's no socket. So let's take a look at how we can remove the motherboard from this chassis now. And here we have it, the motherboard and the expansion card. So let's see if we can separate those. So this should normally just pop out. And what we see here is kind of an ISA expansion card of sorts. I'm guessing this is a standard ISA pinout. So I'm going to take a look at that later, but first I want to focus on the main board itself. So let's first get rid of this IDE cable, which is used to hook up a hard drive to the system. As you can see, it's kind of glued together using this white material. Don't think it's necessary anymore for my particular use case to glue every single connector in place here, as I'm not going to take this onto the battlefield anymore. So yeah, I'm going to see later on if I can clean all of that stuff up. But this is just the IDE connector to hook up a 2.5-inch hard drive, or in my particular case, a compact flash card. So let's take a closer look. We have two connectors here which are used to hook up the other PCB which holds the video chip. The keyboard connector is also here, and a couple of other connectors. So this appears to be an ISA connector to hook up the expansion card, which holds the radio. Now, these are not the standard SIMs that came with the laptop, because I wanted to rule out if the video issue was somehow related to the system RAM, which was not the case. So these were the original SIMs that came with the PC. So we have 2 times 32 megabytes of RAM, giving this system a total of 64 megabytes. And yeah, a nice little compact board. On the bottom we have the Intel CPU with the cooler. We have some kind of other feature connector here at the bottom. Not really sure what that is about. There's some patch wires going on here. So yeah, not really sure what this connector is for. Seems to be connected to this one. So yeah, all in all, a nice little compact design. So let's move along and look at the power supply. So that was a tight fit. So there is still a cable connected to the power supply. So let's go ahead and remove that. And then we can completely separate our power supply. So let's take a look at that one. But before we do that, here's a look at the case, which is now completely gutted. The only thing which is still here are a couple of cables coming from the LCD, the PC speaker, and the fan. But at least now we can actually run the PC in a very minimal configuration using just the power supply, the motherboard, and the video daughter board, which is always nice to test things in isolation. But now it's time to take a look inside the power supply. And just look at this very compact power supply. I mean, in terms of serviceability, this is a nightmare. I mean, just look at how everything is packed together. There are components all over the place. There are a lot of smaller PCBs which are stacked vertically, and beneath them are all kinds of other components. So servicing this will definitely be a small nightmare. I do have the impression that the caps seem to be okay, and I'm not really expecting there to be lots of issues with this power supply, so hopefully it's just going to be the video. But at least now we can test the thing in isolation. So we just need to hook up the power supply to the main board and we should get an output. And while that does seem to be the case, I have the impression that things have gotten a lot worse. But you know, when I put my fingers on the RAM chips, for example, I have the impression that the image kind of stabilizes somewhat. So hopefully it's just going to be some bad connection or something. So in the next video, I'll definitely be doing some more in-depth investigation on this, hooking up a scope, seeing if I can see something. In the meantime, if you guys have any suggestions, please let me know in the comments below, and hopefully we can get this fixed in the next video. So I hope you've enjoyed this little tour of the military laptop's internals. I hope you guys will stick around for part 3, where hopefully we will be able to fix this screen issue. So to everybody out there, stay safe, stay healthy, and see you guys soon. Bye-bye.